So, I live in the southwest of the UK. Years ago, when I was 17, this would be about 15 years ago, I got kicked out by my mum, who I was living with, because we had an argument. I wandered the streets that night, trying to stay awake. I asked my friends if I could stay with them, but that wasn't an option, unfortunately. At the time, I lived in a relatively new suburban area, so I decided to walk into the nearby woods that overlooked some farmland, hoping to watch the stars and find a place to sleep. This was around 2 a.m. There was a large wooded area near some flats, and I crawled through a thicket, which led to an open space. As I walked through, it was pitch black, and I thought this would be a nice, safe area to try and sleep. As I laid down, suddenly, I heard footsteps. They sounded heavy and loud, and it sounded like they were circling me. I froze and asked if anyone was there. The footsteps got faster and faster, pacing around me. Then, I heard a deep growl. It sounded big. I panicked and ran away, through the thicket and onto the street. At the time, I had about £100 in my bank account, so I wandered to a nearby hotel to see if I could get a room, but they would not let me in. I was cold, desperate and scared, so I walked to a nearby 24-hour shop, bought some snacks, a torch, flashlight for you Americans, and made my way back to the thicket. This time, I was armed with a light. When I returned to the woods, I heard the footsteps again. I quickly turned on the torch, shining it all around, looking for where the footsteps were coming from, but I couldn't see anything. Then, I heard the growl again. It was deep and reverberating. It sounded like it was right next to me. I could hear it, but not see it. But it sounded big. No matter how much I shone the torch, I could not see what was making the noise. I ran away to a nearby bus stop and spent the night there, awake but scared. The next day I met up with a friend and told her what happened. I wanted to investigate, so me and her went to go through the thicket into this open space. She was scared after the story I told her, but it was broad daylight. I went in again, and she stayed outside. I heard the growl again, really loud and really close. It was daylight though. I could hear it, but not see it. I know this sounds made up, but please believe me. It scares the hell out of me, and no one believes what I witnessed. If anyone has any similar stories, please let me know. I will be the first to admit, I thought these types of cryptids were a joke and not real, and I've never been able to take them seriously. I am an outdoorsman and have been for 35 years. I grew up in the woods. I memorized trees for mushroom hunting for a living. I knew every brook, stream, bush, berry grove, log, you name it. I'm on a forest road, and I'm on hour 9 of not a soul in sight. I gather some mushrooms and look up the road to see a rock has fallen from the loose, steep side of the mountain to the middle of the road. I make a mental note that I have to move it and not drive over it. I gather my mushrooms and get back to the car. I look up and see what appears to be a 2 or 2.5 foot tall little brown thing walking the side of the road over to the rock. my first logical thought is that it's a squirrel. But I see it is walking on two legs. It appears to be wearing brown cloth or fur clothes, and is shaped like a human, but very tiny. It's not scurrying either. It's ambling on two legs like a human would. Just casually walking like this is some normal, regular-ass thing, like monotonous work it does for a living. I don't believe my lying eyes. It has to be something else. I get back in the car and head up the road and see that the rock has been pushed back to the side of the road from whence it came. It had fallen off the hill, rolled to my left, then was sitting back on the other side of the road on the right. There are drag marks like someone slid it back. I look, I smell, I sense, I listen. Nothing. I don't know where gnomes live, but the old, partially logged section where I was looked pretty perfect for a clan of these things. Lots of places to hide, secluded, near water, plenty of routes of escape, and would be easy to dig little holes in the mountain and be fortified against invaders. The side road into it was flooded and appears to do so regularly, so these little guys even have their own moat. I'm positive I'm overthinking this. It was a long drive back up the mountain, then down the mountain the other way, and some time home, and I can't pick this apart into anything else but being a tiny little forest man. I'm like 1000% positive that I saw what I saw. It was near a military special interest zone, allegedly blocked off due to some native butterflies. But I'm starting to wonder if this research area is really about butterflies after all. They send you to prison, ban you from parks, and give you a $5,000 fine if you take a single berry from inside that boundary. This is the story of an experience I had in Cradle Mountain National Park in Tasmania, Australia, in my early teens. Despite causing no physical injury, it has haunted me into adulthood. I grew up in a family of avid hikers, both my mother, a botanist, and my father, a biologist for the University of Tasmania, would regularly visit the deepest wilderness areas of Tasmania during their field studies. These trips were disguised as camping and hiking adventures for the family. I never minded, as I was just as passionate about the outdoors as they were, even from a young age. Keyword being was, as after what I went through, even 20 plus years later, I still refused to return. We lived on a property a short driving distance from Lake St. Clair, a popular tourist destination. This was the only place my parents would allow me to camp and experience the wilderness alone, as long as I brought my German Shepherd with me. He was a former police dog and very well trained. At 12 or 13 years old, I didn't mind. It felt like my own little slice of freedom in my own little slice of wilderness, despite being surrounded by people. It was easy to ignore them, but as I got older and more brazen, I found myself hounding my parents to let me take my quad bike deeper into the park to camp, to test my own abilities and prove to them that I was capable of doing so and that I wasn't a little kid anymore. It was that overconfidence that led me to that situation and caused me this trauma. I was 15 at the time of the experience, at the age where I thought I was invincible, knew all there was to know, and was untouchable. After asking my parents for what felt like an uncountable number of times and being told no just as many times, I had enough and decided to just go. I told my parents that I and a few friends were going to the lake to camp and do some fishing over the weekend. Instead, I took my tent, my quad, and headed to the reserve. I left just after sunrise to maximize daylight and to make it as far in as I felt comfortable. Once arriving, I set up camp, had some food, and decided to go for an explore. I knew of a spot nearby with a gorgeous rock face where fossils had been found in the past, so I thought I'd try my luck. Shortly into the walk, I realized I'd been turned around and had no idea where I was anymore. At the time, I didn't see it as that big of a deal, as I had a compass and knew that if I headed south, it would take me back to the lake, and I could walk from there. However, by this time it was getting late in the afternoon, so, stupidly, I decided to take my chances and make it back to my camp and quad bike, so I wasn't walking back to camp from the lake in the dark. Big mistake. It was about 4:30 p.m. and the sun had begun to dip below the tree line, casting dark shadows across my walking path. That's when the forest went silent. And when I say silent, I mean silent. No wind, no birds, no forest sounds at all, which made my heart rate skyrocket. It was getting dark and the silence was suffocating. I just wanted to get back to my camp, light a fire, eat some snacks and spend my night watching nature's television until I fell asleep. That's when, from every direction, I would hear the sound of twigs cracking and something moving in the canopy above me. No big deal, probably birds or other small animals, I thought. But then, clear as day,
"Hey, come here."
At first I felt relieved, as I thought someone along the trails had seen me, noticed I was a bit disheveled, and wanted to help. But looking around, I saw no one. Then it happened again, but behind me this time. The same voice, but I noticed it was coming from up in the trees. I responded, "I can't see you. Where are you?" and asked for some help because I thought I just couldn't see the person calling out. But then it happened again, from my left this time. That's when I decided to run. I took off into the brush and ran for a good 2 minutes before I stopped to catch my breath and look at my compass to start making my way towards the lake. I was terrified, but felt I had covered enough distance that I wasn't in immediate danger. But seconds after checking my compass and starting to walk, I heard it again.
"Hey, come here."
But this time, it was right behind me. I spun around and saw absolutely nothing, so I began sprinting again and didn't stop. The last thing I heard before bursting out of the trees onto the lakefront was the most evil, demonic laugh I'd ever heard. It sounded like 3 people laughing at once. I immediately called my parents to come and get me, told them what I did and what happened, but they were more focused on my disobedience than my experience. The moment they picked me up was the first time I felt relief, and I cried the whole drive home. I didn't sleep properly for days. My dad went and picked up my quad and tidied up my camp. Since that day, I haven't stepped foot away from the lake. If anyone has had an experience like this, I'd love to hear it, because it took my passion from me. I miss being out away from society, but I just can't bring myself to do it. This story takes place in November of 2022. At the time, I drew a special elk tag in the Beaverhead mountain range of central/east Idaho. I had hunted in this area many times before over the years, and I know the area like the back of my hand. It became a place of comfort and good memories. It still is, but I haven't looked at it the same since the story I am about to tell. I planned for a week-long trip for the first week of November and took one of my best friends with me. We spent the first 4 days hiking up and down various ridges, chasing elk and having a blast. The nights were spent storytelling and eating soup by the stove. Mind you, it was November in Idaho, so it was very cold. It was the 4th night of the trip. It had snowed during the day, and a fresh layer of snow lay on the ground. The sky had since cleared up, and a very cold, but still and quiet air had settled in. My friend and I had gotten into a deep discussion about the Bible, spirits, cryptids, skinwalkers, etc. I should note that my friend had at the time experienced a decline in his mental health, and it was not uncommon for him to sometimes behave erratically. This will be relevant later in the story. During this conversation, I felt an intense fear kind of settled on me. It almost felt like the air had become tense. I had the urge to change the discussion to something else, but that's when it happened. Within 20 or 30 yards of the tent, what I thought at first was a coyote began yipping and barking very, very loudly. I looked at my friend, who became excited and told me to grab my gun so we could go look for this thing. It was strange though, and something didn't feel right. The animal, whatever it was, didn't exactly sound like a coyote. It almost shrieked as opposed to yipping the way coyotes do. And it would occasionally bark, and at times almost scream. I'm also an experienced outdoorsman, and any other hunter knows a coyote would not approach a tent in the middle of nowhere and draw attention to itself. It would continue to vocalize for about 3 to 5 minutes at a time, circling the tent from a distance. I reluctantly grabbed my rifle and my spotlight, a very bright, intense flashlight, and started looking for this thing. As I stepped about 10 yards away from the tent, I heard it again, directly in front of me, shrieking, barking, etc. I shined my light directly at it. I could see probably 150 to 200 yards in front of me, yet nothing was there. No eyes shining in the light, no outline of an animal or person, nothing. After repeating this same scenario 3 or 4 times, we gave up and went back in the tent to warm up. But the sound wouldn't stop. At one point, when it went silent, my friend poked his head out of the tent and yelled, "Hey, shut up!" He was immediately answered with a scream from the animal. At times, it sounded like it came from above the tent in the tree we were camped under. I tried playing it off as a coyote or maybe a hunting dog that got lost, but I could not convince myself that it was either of those, and we ignored it for the rest of the time. It slowly started getting further and further away from the tent, until it finally stopped about an hour or so later. The next morning I looked around the area for tracks, yet, to my surprise, I found nothing but our own. We didn't talk about it for the rest of the trip, and a few days later we went home. Now, I don't know if it is all related, but about 3 months after this, my friend had a complete mental breakdown and has since never been on a hunting trip. Some of his family, a deeply religious family, questioned whether he was a victim of some spiritual attack or something of that nature. I didn't correlate the two at the time, but in hindsight, I have so many questions about that night. Is it a coincidence? Whatever that animal was appeared during that particular conversation? Could it have actually been a coyote or wolf? Why couldn't I see any eyes gleaming with the flashlight? Did this incident have something to do with my friend's mental decline? My friend would sometimes tell me and others about strange things he saw or heard. Was this related? If anyone has anything to point out, please share. Long-time lurker, first-time poster. I haven't been able to stop thinking about this incident and wanted to see if it resonates with anyone else. Me, male 28, my wife, female 28, and my dog, male 3, recently went to Red River Gorge, a state park in southeast Kentucky. We're no strangers to camping in the park, having been there at least 20 times over the past 8 years. We chose a spot I've been to 2 or 3 times before. It's worth noting that this site is outside of other dispersed camping areas and is essentially the only proper spot with car parking along a 2-mile stretch of road. There's a dilapidated barn about a mile up from where we drove in and a cemetery about 1/3 of a mile in the opposite direction. Otherwise, it's a rarely traveled road. And we saw no one all day, just an occasional car, maybe 1 or 2 an hour. The spot is at the base of a 30-foot incline that a 4x4 could handle. Our SUV was parked horizontally at the top, blocking other vehicles from descending. From there, it's about 30 yards into the campground, with another slope leading to the river's edge and swimming hole. The day went great. We spent time near the beach, letting our dogs swim, then did typical camping activities like hiking, foraging, chopping wood, throwing the hatchet, and enjoying a few beers. Once sunlight began to fade, around 6:30, we started the fire and began cooking dinner. As darkness fell and the last light disappeared, we heard the usual sounds: squirrels rustling, things falling into the leaves, which spooked my wife a bit, but we didn't think much of it. Then, at about 9 p.m., sitting around a healthy fire and listening to music, we heard heavy shuffling in the leaves, definitely something large or heavy. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the road, about halfway between us and our car. I stopped the music, and after about 10 seconds of dead silence, we heard the shuffling again. Before I could call out, we heard this strange and unnatural noise. Something like a throttling, ascending pitch mixed with a shriek. Neither of us can verbally describe it, and I can confidently say I've never heard anything like it before. It was about 20 to 25 feet away, just outside the reach of my headlamp. Our dog went insane, hair standing on end, barking incessantly into the darkness. He was on a long lead, or I'm sure he would have taken off after it. My wife and I were frozen. I was holding my hatchet and trying to catch any movement or sound to track. After about 2 to 3 minutes of that, with no further noises, I calmed the dog and we grabbed some essentials and hurried to the car. Our adrenaline was pumping as we discussed coyotes, foxes, or other animals as the possible culprits. I didn't want to mention the possibility of people, as that would have heightened the paranoia. We eventually passed out after about an hour, but I spent the rest of the night in and out of shallow sleep, feeling very uncomfortable, both mentally and physically. I've always struggled to sleep anyway, except fully horizontal. At around 3 a.m., right next to my head, I heard a singular knock on my window, like someone tapped the glass with one knuckle. My wife didn't wake up, and I scanned the outside of the car, but didn't see or hear anything. I struggled to doze off again, and my heartbeat was rapid. When we finally got the first light around 7 a.m., we cooked breakfast, packed up our campsite, and got the hell out of Dodge. No prints or anything out of sorts with our remaining belongings either. What's strange to me is that after hearing the noise, we heard no additional heavy shuffling from the source. With our dog barking so aggressively, we should have heard whatever was moving away. We've looked up various animal noises native to the gorge, and nothing even remotely resembles what we heard. The knock on the window was also isolated, There were no other noises or visible happenings outside the car immediately following. Lastly, I had a thought the day after we left. I remember whistling for our dog after dark, since we had some scraps to give him near the fire. Immediately, I thought, shit, I shouldn't have whistled. But up until this trip, I've never been a believer of those superstitions. I just like to respect the folklore I've heard. In hindsight, we're now convinced I may have invited a Wendigo or Skinwalker to our camp. I won't take those superstitions lightly again, and I'm sure this occurrence will affect at least my next few overnights in those woods. Hello watchers and listeners, thank you all so much for listening. If you have a story you'd like to share with the channel, please send it to my email, which will be found in the description below. If you'd like to support the channel, consider signing up for my Patreon, which you can watch my videos ad-free and usually with bonus stories, as well as other perks depending on the level. This year, I will be redesigning my merch store, so keep an eye out for that one. And as always, the biggest thank you is to all of you. I truly appreciate all of your support over the last couple of years. And remember,
Papa loves you.